Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Resourcing Small Churches, presented by Cynthia Cushman. I'm Jana Blazek. I'll be your host for today's presentation. I'm a teaching elder in the Presbytery of Chicago, and I'm also the associate editor for Call to Worship. And many of you may know that the small church residency program is scheduled to conclude at the end of 2017. However, many mid-councils have expressed an interest in learning more about how to integrate this model into their presbyteries, their synods, and the work that they're already doing. So today, Cindy Cushman is going to cover the basic components of the residency model and guide you through some of the considerations of adopting a similar program in your context. Now, some of you have already submitted questions when you registered, but keep in mind that as we go along, you are free to type questions and, in fact, encouraged to do so. Go to the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, move your cursor to the questions panel, and type your questions. Once Cindy gets through her presentation, we'll take as many questions as we have time for. So now let's meet our presenter. Cindy Cushman has been the coordinator of the Small Church Residency Program since 2012, and she'll continue to fill this role through the end of the program. However, she's now also serving as the organizing pastor of a 5-church parish in the Ohio Valley Presbytery. So now I'll turn the floor over to Cindy to share more about what she's doing and what you can learn from the Small Church Program.
Thank you, Jana. The first thing I wanted to say is this webinar itself probably won't be so all-encompassing that you could just take it and run with it, or maybe you can. So feel free to contact me afterwards also for those that are interested. The intent was to give a sense of whether you want to pursue it or not, and hopefully this will do that for you. So just a brief rundown on the program. I've been with it since 2012. It's actually been going since 2009, and I think the first class was 2010. It was really designed as a pilot project and then actually went on a few years past the pilot project because it was popular with the presbyteries that had experienced it. And as we've come to prepare to close the program, I had spoken with my supervisor and some others that there are some really good learnings from the program that I hope we wouldn't lose. And some of what I consider to be the most beneficial aspects of the program are the pieces that the presbyteries and the mid-councils really did more so than our office did. So it seemed like something that folks could capture and do on their own, even without the national program. There are 3 basic components to the program. The first one was the training that happens in Louisville at the beginning of service and after the first year. That training, we use staff from here at the Presbyterian Center who specialize in different areas that worked with the new pastors on developing pastoral authority and identity, church revitalization and community outreach, understanding the small church, the use of social media and church websites. Some of those pieces would vary year to year. But it's just basically as they start to actually go into practical ministry, giving them some of the tools that the seminaries maybe didn't so much or that weren't as relevant until they were actually in place. The second piece of it was the mentoring. Presbyteries would match the new pastor with an experienced pastor in the presbytery who meets with them once a month at least one-on-one and is available through email and phone calls at other times. Typically, that experienced pastor was at least somewhat familiar with the context and the congregation that the resident was serving. And then the third piece was also centered at the presbytery level, and that's the learning cluster group, where a group of new pastors and mentors would meet together once a month for most of a day for worship, study, reflection, and case study discussions. In my opinion, at least, by far the most effective piece of the program has been the mentors and the learning cluster groups, the piece that was directed and managed by presbyteries, not the national office. And that's part of why I wanted to do this, because it does seem like a model anyone could use, even if they adapt it to their own needs in their own presbytery. So just to give you a sense of what we saw, some of the concrete benefits from this program for the new pastors, it helped decrease the sense of isolation that many new pastors of small churches feel. I think this is kind of a particular thing for small church pastors because they don't have a staff that they're working with kind of thing. And so having that community of other new pastors who are also serving small churches, and having that extended time together once a month really built good relationships that helped them not feel quite so alone in their first call. It helped new pastors avert some of the typical new pastor mistakes that are often made. Both the mentoring and I think that community cluster group, both of those things helped that. And even if they already made them, help them navigate them and get through them more successfully when they have someone to call on to give them advice and that sort of thing. It offered a space for action reflection model learning with a trusted group of other new pastors and mentors, enabling them to gain new insight and learn from one another. One of the things I love about the program as new pastors start ministry, using that model with the learning cluster group kind of helps keep them mindful that we continue to learn all through our ministry, and having that space to do that with others, I think is energizing for pastors and is very beneficial as they continue in leadership. And it just generally strengthened leadership skills of the new pastors, just with the ongoing study that they did and that sort of thing. Some of the benefits we saw for the congregations: virtually every church that participated engaged in some form of new ministry during the 2-year program. There's something about the congregations signing on to this program that opened them, I think, more to doing new things. And with the guidance and support and the extra training that the new pastors received, I think they were better able to help churches do this. It helped raise the energy level in congregations to be participating and to have presbytery support. Kind of gave a sense of our church matters to the presbytery, because the presbytery was investing in us by putting us in this program. So it helped morale. In cases where churches were yoking for the first time or doing something else new, the 2-year residency term made them willing to give it a try and take a risk, since they knew they weren't necessarily committed beyond the 2 years. So it just made them more willing to take that step and see what happened with it. Some of the intangible benefits of the model, things we weren't necessarily thinking about that we saw happen, that I think are pretty cool for the most part. Mentors often express that the experience revitalized them in their own ministry as well, that they just loved doing the mentoring of the younger pastors and the newer pastors, and it just energized them for their own ministry. The second one, I have a few different examples. It kept rough first call experiences from being failures. New pastors who lacked confidence became successful pastors with the extra nourishment. With each of these pieces of the rough first call experiences, I have specific examples in mind of residents. We did have one a few years ago who had the pieces and the knowledge to be a pastor, but just really wasn't kind of claiming that pastor authority, really struggled with moderating session meetings the first couple of times, and had a mentor that really worked with him. And by the end of the first year, you could see a difference. And by the end of the second year, he was a very successful pastor who his congregations loved. And I actually had a conversation with both the mentor and the EP at one point saying, I'm not sure he would have been successful without the program. And with the program, he's just a really good pastor. And so it was neat to see that kind of thing happen. Also, new pastors struggling with obstructionists in their congregations were not turned off from serving the church. Not all congregations have these, but we had run into ones where there were people who just were really against whatever a pastor was trying to do, or against having the church change in any way. And it can be really frustrating for any pastor, but certainly for new pastors who really don't know how to get around this, or don't know how to deal with it. In many cases, I think with pastors in new calls who experience this, they leave the ministry because of it, because they tend to think this is what service is going to be like always. And what we found with the support of that learning cluster group and the mentors, people that even chose to leave after the 2 years, and we didn't have a lot of these, but the ones who did, because of particular power dynamics in their congregation, didn't have that spread through their whole feeling of this is what ministry is always going to be. They moved on to other calls and still felt positive because they had that learning cluster group and the mentors that both gave them a reality check and also continued to support them and encourage them to know that they did have gifts for ministry, even though they were struggling in that particular setting. Now, on the flip side of that, you have new pastors who don't start off right with that there can be early problems in getting along with the congregation that are really more the pastor's fault than the congregation's fault. And we had a couple different examples of this. One of them in particular that I can remember, a lot of the problems initially were cultural. The person was from the Northeast and was serving a Midwestern rural congregation. And just her whole way of communicating turned people off initially. And for a while there, the Presbytery was wondering if this call was even going to make it because they were just so frustrated with each other. But because there was a mentor there who saw that going on and went for help and said, I think they just need some help learning how to communicate with each other. The Presbytery managed to get a coach for the new pastor and worked with her and helped her realize some of this. And it became a very successful call, and she stayed past the residency. In fact, I think she's still there now. So just because of that extra eyes and ears on the situation, primarily through mentors, that can really help situations that don't have to go awry keep from going awry just because there's been a few missteps. Because we all know new pastors, all of us when we were new pastors made some missteps. Another one of the intangibles, the energy and participating congregations spilled over to the larger Presbytery community, having a positive effect on other churches in the Presbytery. I think Charlie Spencer's on this call, and I'm going to let him speak to that at the end of the presentation if he's interested in doing that, because he really saw that in his Presbytery now. A few more details on the pieces of the model if you, as a Presbytery, were thinking about trying to use this. On mentors, first of all. Choosing mentors. You want experienced pastors who are good listeners, who preferably have some knowledge or familiarity of the church the new pastor is serving, but not necessarily. I think that good listeners part is more important. One of the things I would say about choosing mentors is that's not a role that I would ask for volunteers. That's a role that is Presbytery leadership, whether it's COM, whether it's Executive Presbytery, or whoever is managing this program, that you think through and target people to ask to do this. Because there are people who are very good pastors who wouldn't necessarily make a good mentor, and so you want to think through some of that. Mentor training. I would say don't skimp on this. We, through all the years of our program, we brought in Laurie Ferguson to train our mentors, and she's really wonderful, but she's certainly not the only person who could do this. Many presbyteries these days have coaches that they use with congregations or with pastors. Probably anyone who's a certified coach could develop an effective mentor training session, but you want mentors to go in with some kind of training, kind of giving them a framework of what that mentoring role is and helping them think through that before they become a mentor. Compensation. The program paid them $100 a month. I will tell you the vast majority of them would have done this without the pay. So I don't think that's something you have to do to try to do this model. And some of them actually refuse to accept the money. You probably have people in your presbyteries who would make really good mentors who don't really like being on committees. And so the mentoring could become kind of part of their service to the presbytery, because that's the kind of work they would prefer to do. It would be really good if you can reimburse expenses, mileage, meals, and that kind of thing. And you might consider other options for compensation or appreciation, even if you can't give them a monthly stipend. But I will reiterate, I don't think not having a monthly stipend would be a deal breaker for most people willing to be a mentor. Set a time period. For our program, the residency itself was 2 years. Even if you aren't doing something as formal as a residency program per se, but you're doing this mentoring and learning cluster group for new pastors, I still think it's good to have a time period so it's not just unending. Our program was 2 years. You may do it the first year a person's in, you may do it 3. But make sure there is a timeline for it. On learning cluster groups. The time frame of these learning cluster groups when they would get together once a month, the mentors and the new pastors, it was generally 1 day a month. Our program, when we presented it to the folks in the program, we said 6 hours. But I really think a minimum of 4 hours, including a meal, is really, I think it's what makes it as significant of a community for the people than if they just spend an hour together once a month. I think you build stronger relationships with that more extended period of time together. You're also not rushed to get through all those pieces of a learning cluster group agenda in a day. And then, of course, just sharing the meal together, too, I think helps build just the sense of community. There needs to be a strong commitment to attend. If you're having it and there's always more than one or two gone without particular reasons, I don't think you build the same kind of community. So it's one of those things, somehow you want to set it up that folks are really committed to doing this and taking that time out of their work week once a month. The basic components of the learning cluster groups were worship, sharing, that's just more personal sharing kind of, study of some kind, case study, reflections, and a meal. So those are the pieces that you do in those 4 hours. They can be arranged in any way, shape, or form. The leadership of those pieces can be split up from different people month to month. The components of what you study together can change. The case study reflections, depending on how big your group is, you may not do everybody every month and take turns. There's lots of different ways to put that together, but those were the key pieces. Structure the time however you want to, but structure it. And again, I think the longer a group is together, that structure might loosen, but I think it really helps everyone feel comfortable and get engaged in the group if you start with a very firm structure that everyone understands and knows what they're trying to do. Those study topics that I mentioned may vary widely. And I would say whatever you do, start with a plan for the first few months, and then you may let the group have input on their topics. And in our years with the program, we saw different groups do very different things. I know Heartland Presbytery, at least in the beginning, the presbytery kind of handled setting up those study topics, and a lot of it was dealing with like all those firsts that you do as a new pastor, your first funeral, your first wedding, and just kind of try to resource those new pastors with those different topics from month to month. West Virginia Presbytery, on the other hand, was particularly conscious of the Appalachian culture that these new pastors were coming into and wanting them to have an understanding of that. So their first few, I think probably their first 6 months, was they were doing book studies together that had to do with the Appalachian culture and understanding it. So I think where you are and who's involved in the group may impact what topics you decide to do. And again, once you've gotten going after 6 months or so, you may want to let the group take over and decide what those topics are together. But you want to have a plan. Don't skip the case study work. This is probably the piece they want to do the least that's the most beneficial. The case study work involves them bringing to the group an actual experience they had during that past month in their ministry, and laying it out and getting feedback and helping them process what could you have done differently, what different outcomes might have happened if you had done it differently, that sort of thing. The piece that we used to provide the framework for that is a lot like CPE verbatims in terms of the process, if that kind of gives you a sense of it. But and that's a piece I could certainly share with folks later too. But I think that part is so critical. And again, it's the part they resist probably the most, but probably helps them the most. And I think you would hear the residents say that too, that they really valued that after they did it. Some of the other things you will want to be thinking about if you're wanting to pursue this, and I don't necessarily have the answers for you because the answers might be different for each of you, but just to toss out, if you're thinking about pursuing this and trying to incorporate this in some way, shape, or form in your presbytery, even if you're going to adapt it to be something different than what we did, you want to think through some of these questions. Do you want all new pastors to participate, including associate pastors? I think that can certainly work. I think it would be a little different if you did it that way. Your study topics might change and be a little more broad if you were incorporating associate pastors too. I think you would want to be very careful about making sure that associate pastors, supervisors weren't mentors or in that learning cluster group, so that they have freedom to share any of their frustrations they might have in their position. Do you want to try to recruit new pastors for your program? We may get at this more at the question time too, but I will be frank, this was one of the weaker parts of our program, and that was primarily because it never had a full-time staff person the whole time the program was going. So we didn't spend as much time on recruiting candidates for the positions because we just didn't have it. We didn't have the time or the resources or the travel funds or anything to do that. But that might be something you might actually be more effective at, doing that regionally with the seminaries that are closer to you. I don't know, but that's something to think through. Do you want to really target and go out and look for people to fill these positions? Do you want to name the position something different? Like when you're filling out an MIF, do you want to actually call it a pastoral resident or designated pastor, and then you could make it a set time period like our program was? I don't think you have to do that. I think you could, again, with the different ways Presbyterians can adapt it, you can just say this is going to be a program for all your new pastors, and so that doesn't necessarily matter. If you really want to do more like what the residency program did, where it's a term position, and this is these pieces, the mentoring, the cluster group, are really considered part of their call, then you might want to have that show up in some way in the MIF, if that makes sense. Will you provide any incentives to participating churches or new pastors? This is the part that could easily get lost as you transfer to a presbytery level program rather than national. I will say that financial incentives really weren't huge ever for the program for the churches. It was significant enough to be significant. It was $4,000 per year. But in another way, $4,000 isn't really enough to make a huge difference. Like for those that were calling full-time pastors, $4,000 doesn't make or break whether you can call a full-time pastor or not, that kind of thing. So the incentives were small, but I know some of our executive presbyters were a big proponent of saying, but even if it's just a small amount, the fact that the presbytery is willing to invest in them and say, we're going to give you this little bit to help you, it still helps the churches think, okay, well then we really need to do something if we're getting some financial help as part of doing this, and it kind of makes them a little more gung-ho for the program. New pastors, the main incentives they got was the trainings, and also they were eligible for some of the debt relief programs at the national level. And if you were going to pursue this, we could have conversations with Laura Bryan about whether those could happen for those participating in such programs at the presbytery level also, even though our program is ending. One of the things I would like to hear back from you before we close is what kind of follow-up would be helpful if this has interested you enough that you want to try to pursue doing something like it, even if it's not exactly like what we do. How can we help? I'm with the denomination for another year, and we're down to just one class. So I would like to do what I can to help any get off the ground if they're wanting to try to do this. So I just tossed out some examples here, but if you have others, I'd be happy to hear those as well. Would follow-up webinars that are more focused on a particular part be helpful in any way, like one just on mentor training, or one on recruitment of new pastors, or identifying churches that might be good candidates for the program? I'm willing to work on that if you think that would be helpful. And would there be print resources that would be helpful in any way? Some of the things that I actually have on hand that would be easy to send out to people is that case study reflection model, the learning cluster group planning and sample agendas, a mentor training manual. I don't have a mentor training manual, but that's something we could work to put together maybe. But those first two are things I have on hand that I could send to any. And are there any others that you think would be helpful that I haven't mentioned here? So we're at questions. So that's my spiel. And I hope that was helpful enough to give you a sense of what are the things you need to know and whether this is something that you want to pursue.
Thank you, Cindy. And now's your time, folks, to pose your questions to Cindy or offer some feedback to some of the questions she's raised. So Cindy, here's our first question. Someone's asked how Synod communications staff can help with this effort.
I think it depends on if you know you have presbyteries in your synod interested in doing the program. Certainly, I could see that person being a liaison between the presbyteries that are trying to do it. If that person wanted to work more closely with me in the next to get some of these answers to the questions and disseminate more of that information, that certainly could help. That's just off the top of my head. I don't know if that was a helpful answer or not.
All right, moving on to our next question. Someone has asked, how might this model help small churches to successfully hire pastoral leadership after a long-term pulpit vacancy?
Good question. I think the extra support that the new pastor gets is helpful for a church that hasn't had a pastor in a while. One of the things that I think happens with small churches, whether they've had pastors recently or not, is because they're small, they're kind of used to being able to do things on their own. And especially if they haven't had a regular pastor in a while, there are ways that the pastor doesn't necessarily get into the communication loop of the church initially, or the pastor might be coming in and it might feel like they're bulldozing because the church has been so used to doing things on their own all the time. I think that mentoring and learning cluster group can help that transition go smoother for both the congregation and the new minister.
We've got a couple of questions now that are somewhat similar, and both of them are looking for ways to find others who are interested in starting a program like this. One asks how to find out if folks from other presbyteries in our area are interested so they could work together as a synod. And as maybe a related question, someone else is asking if it's possible to share the list of folks who were participants on today's webinar so that they might continue discussions offline.
That's a question for you, Jana. I'm fine with sharing it. I guess if everyone here is fine with sharing it. And I can certainly take the list and see what synods everyone's from and just send those synod folks and saying, hey, the people from these presbyteries were on this webinar. You might want to touch base with them. And, I can help facilitate that way too. Do you have anything to add to that one, Jana? Or
no, I can definitely push it up the totem pole and see if the folks who are behind this are willing to share that list.
Okay.
So the next question says, the small church residency program provides fairly minimal cost and support, yet it seems like it's had a strong effect on a number of churches. What do you take away from that, Cindy?
I'm not quite sure. I think part of it too is that when you talk about it has had a strong effect, I believe that wholeheartedly. I will say that strong effect has not necessarily played out in huge jumps in membership. And if that's all you're looking for, that's not necessarily what you get out of it. I think it has had strong effects in revitalization. In churches, helping churches find their purpose, helping them get energized for ministry, being in touch with their communities in new ways. It's done all of those things. I think the training in Louisville has been part of it. That they do get some good facilitation and content in those trainings from the best in our denomination who do that kind of thing, like Ann Philbrick. But I also think a huge part of it is the mentoring and that learning cluster group. Because I think their pastors that are in this program are constantly learning, and they have the other people in their group to bounce their ideas off of. So I think them helping move a congregation forward, that extra support and extra knowledge from the other people they're constantly interacting with helps them do that more effectively. And I think they're happier. I think having that community makes them happier in their call, and I think that's conveyed to a congregation. And in small congregations, when I lead that understanding small church training piece of the program, one of the things I always say with small churches is relationships are critical, and congregations want you to love them, and if they feel like you love them, they will love you back. And I think that happens more strongly with these because I think they're happier in their call because they've got that community group that helps them stay energized and helps them not overinflate any of the problems that they have and that kind of thing, and can have a more positive outlook.
Thank you. All right, we've got a couple questions about funding. Can you talk about some creative funding options for a program like this and how it might be adapted for a presbytery that is working on?
I'm probably a really weak person to, because I don't have much funding experience myself. There might be other people on this call that have better answers to that than I do. I will say about the only thing I can bring to that off the top of my head is when we transitioned the program from the pilot project, when we no longer had the foundation grant, and we had the presbyteries take on part of the funding of the program for these last 2 years it's been. A lot of presbyteries have some funding pockets in areas of church revitalization or church transformation or that kind of thing. And so most of the presbyteries said, yeah, we can come up with that amount of money, even though it was just, $1,000 or $2,000 per church. So there is some money there. You might approach some of your bigger churches in your presbytery and say, would you like to help strengthen the smaller churches in this presbytery with your resources, and see if maybe they would sponsor a church or something. But those are just off the top of my head. And like I said, I am not someone who has a good background in funding, and there are probably other people that could answer that question better than me.
Okay, so the next question has to do with the fact that you have spoken primarily about new seminary graduates, but we've got a couple of folks who are wondering what this program might lend itself to in regards to commissioned ruling elders or leadership development for folks who are part of a congregation.
I'm going to take those two separately. I think one of the ways this program would be stronger at the presbytery or synod level instead of at a national level is I think you could wrap in your commissioned ruling elders into some of those groups. I absolutely see no problem with doing that, incorporating them into that kind of a program. The only question would be is if they're part-time and they have another full-time job, figuring out that learning cluster group at a time when they could go might be a roadblock depending. But yeah, I think commissioned ruling elders also serving small churches could get just as much out of it. And I think you could have a learning cluster group that includes both commissioned ruling elders and new pastors, and I don't see that being a problem. Congregation leadership. I have said before, and I will say again now, I think that was the weak part of this program model, is that we really didn't do much with the actual lay leaders in the congregations. And again, I think that's a piece that it's easier for presbyteries to incorporate than it was for doing it at the national offices. I think you could you could play with what to do with that. But I will say some of the trainings we do, particularly around church revitalization, I have taken some of those and used them with congregations that I'm working with right now and with my previous congregation. And they were very well received and kind of were very aha moments for congregational leadership. So a lot of what we give to pastors, I think it really helps the congregations if they're receiving some of that same information to be on the same page with each other. And if you're doing this at the presbytery level, I think there might be ways for the presbytery to put on a little training for, whatever congregational leaders in the churches participating in the program, and do maybe something on church revitalization, the congregational life cycle, things like that. That's probably easier to provide for them at the local level than at the national level. But it's something we didn't do, and I think it was one of the weaknesses of the program.
Thanks, Cindy. The next person says that half of the churches in her presbytery are both small and rural. What role can the larger, more urban churches play in supporting the life and ministry of the smaller churches?
Are you talking about the larger, more urban churches within your same presbytery, or do you know?
I believe so.
Okay. I think one thing is the one funding thing I mentioned. I love the idea of letting them or inviting larger churches to partner in the support in particular ways with maybe whether it's the compensation or whatever for. It'd be interesting to explore that. I mean, we really haven't done that. I think there are ways that they could both learn from each other, certainly. And maybe some of that congregational leader development could, especially if you're wanting to do, I'm thinking of particular topics of congregational leadership. If you're wanting to do some stuff with worship and with music, there might be people in those larger congregations that could come and resource your small church people on those. And that's just off the top of my head.
Now, earlier during your presentation, you mentioned that Charles Spencer was participating from Heartland Presbytery and maybe William. Right? So I'm going to unmute him and let him weigh in now.
Okay.
This is Charlie Spencer. I don't know that anybody with the power to mute me would have ever unmuted me before. Cindy asked about the kind of tangential benefits, some of what we saw in neighboring congregations, churches who didn't participate, and it was really surprising to us. First of all, we added a presbytery subsidy in addition to the denominational subsidy. It takes in Heartland Presbytery about $52,000 to have a full-time called installed pastor at Presbytery minimum. The initial subsidies were $7,000 a year, and in the end of the program they've been $4,000 a year. It's been amazing to me how so little subsidy inspired the churches to dig deep and find the rest of it. I just didn't anticipate that. I thought if the subsidy's only going to be $4,000, where are they going to get the rest of it? Surely these churches haven't been sitting on the sidelines of calling a pastor because they were $4,000 short. But it's like a 25-cent off coupon or something. It inspired them to find the rest of it. Then we saw churches that didn't participate in the program look and say, well, gosh, if that church down the road got a pastor, we don't want to jump through all the hoops of the program, but what do we have to do to get a pastor? And some of them formed yokes to share a pastor. Some of them just went back and resharpened their pencils and got out a pad and decided they weren't that short and they wouldn't let a $4,000 subsidy keep them from calling a pastor. Some of them called commissioned ruling elders, but there was just sort of this spirit of this church down the road hasn't had a pastor in a long time, and through this program they've got a full-time pastor in their community. How do we get ours?
And did you have anything you'd like to add to that, or anything you'd like to ask Charlie to elaborate on?
Charlie, do you have any thoughts on some of those funding questions?
Well, we found this to be a very popular program in the presbytery, and in, like all presbyteries, there's always more ways to spend the money than there are ways to bring in money. But there was no hesitation to budget money for this program. We did not have to go out and specifically raise money for it, but I think it would have been some of the easiest money we would have raised if we had needed to. Churches do like it. They like the concept. They like getting pastor in places that hadn't had one. They like the pastors, the people who have come through the program. The other thing that we found is it was really a powerful object lesson in the connectionalism of the church. So the Presbytery had money in, General Assembly had money in, and of course the local church had the largest money in. But it really helped even the surrounding churches and remote churches in the Presbytery say this is the connectional system at work. And I think we could have found others to join in that if we had needed, because of kind of the object lesson nature of it, that they saw everybody putting in. The other thing when we've tried other programs of mentoring and so forth, there had been some resentment of why does the presbytery claim our pastor for this time sort of thing. You already have them for presbytery meetings and a committee meeting and whatever. But this was more, we are buying this time, or we are sharing the cost of this pastor, and there was a lot more connection with the pastors in the presbytery because of that financial buy-in. Now, it's not necessarily great that we related through money, but it created that.
Thanks, Charlie. And it looks like we are about at the end of our time, so we have one more question that's come in. And Cindy, I'm wondering if you can share any lessons learned that might apply to churches that are unable to hire a full-time call, but might be interested in doing this program as with a yoked model or perhaps as a part-time pastor.
Yeah, I mean, one of the constant questions I got in my time in this position is churches calling saying, we can't afford a full-time pastor, can we do this program? And the answer from our office was no, it has to be a full-time person, just because of the nature of the program and the Board of Pensions and the ordination and all that. I will say again that the whole yoking, our ones who'd served yoked parishes, and at least two of them it had been more than a couple of decades since they had last been yoked with another congregation before. I think the program helps churches' willingness to do that, and it helps the yoking to be successful. Because churches that, and again, it's amazing what that 2-year time frame did for their openness to try something new. Because it didn't mean they were, it wasn't some permanent unending thing. Well, because you can approach them with it. Well, if it doesn't work when the 2 years are up, you can not opt in the next time, kind of thing. So I think it does help open them to considering yoking, or even like what I'm serving right now, a parish model with more than two even. We did have, in one of the years, we had a 3-church parish with 2 residents, and it was the first time they'd ever done that, and it worked. So I think that both the extra support that the pastors get in maneuvering a new situation like that helps it be successful, as well as the congregation's mindset because of the set time frame might make them a little more willing to show risk. I think at the presbytery level, you may have a little more flexibility to figure out how to make it work with part-time pastors that we just didn't have at the national level. So it would be good, because I do think a lot are moving to that, and pulling in commission ruling elders as well. So I think that might come down to presbytery and what your situations are and what you think will work for you. But I think it can be adapted.
And as you're talking about support, I'm just curious if you've seen any instances where the cluster groups model have worked with other small churches that maybe weren't part of the residency program, but have just tried to implement it in their.
I don't think I have seen that, but that would be neat too. Yeah, that's certainly an offshoot that could happen.
Well, thank you so much, Cindy. We're right at the 45-minute mark, so I would love to ask you to send us out today with a word of blessing or a benediction.
Sure, let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for all of our churches throughout this denomination, the big ones and the little ones. We ask your blessings upon each congregation as they strive to do ministry and serve Christ. Thank you for opportunities to think together and grow and learn together for the benefit of all. We ask your blessings particularly on those who are on this call, that they might be open to your spirit and what you might be calling them to do in their presbyteries and in their congregations as they move forward. And let all God's people say amen.
Amen. Thank you, Cindy, and thanks to you all for taking time out of your day today to join us and to bring some good questions and good topics for conversation. It's my understanding that eventually this will be posted to the denomination's YouTube page so that you can share it or rewatch it or help bring other folks who may be interested in it into the know. Thanks again for your participation. We're so glad to have shared this time with you.
Thank you.